At 4:30 in the morning, Michael Jackson suddenly stood straight up on top of his own bed, and the woman sitting beside him, a nurse practitioner named Sherilyn Lee, said it scared her half to death. His big brown eyes staring straight at her in the dark, his body wired and exhausted at the same time, and the words that came out of his mouth were almost a confession. He told her he simply could not sleep, not for one more night, and he needed her to understand exactly how desperate that had made him. This was April 19th, 2009, inside the rented mansion on North Carolwood Drive that would, just over 2 months later, become the place where Michael Jackson died, and though nobody in that bedroom knew it yet. This strange, unsettling night was the beginning of the end. Lee had come into Jackson's life months earlier, at the start of February, hired not as a doctor, but as a holistic health practitioner, someone he trusted to help him get his body ready for the massive comeback everyone around him was counting on. 50 sold-out shows at London's O2 Arena, a tour called This Is It, meant to prove to the world, and more than anything, to himself, that the king of pop still had something left to give. When Lee first sat down with him, she noticed something small but telling. He was drinking can after can of Red Bull, chasing energy anywhere he could find it, and she suspected right away that his fatigue and jitteriness were tangled up with the sheer volume of caffeine he was pouring into a body that clearly wasn't sleeping enough to recover from anything. She got him off the energy drinks, replaced them with fresh organic juices, started him on intravenous vitamin infusions people call Myers cocktails, a mix of vitamin C and other nutrients meant to rebuild him from the inside, and for a while it actually worked. Jackson told her whatever she instructed him to do, he would do, and within a month he looked healthier, felt sharper, seemed for a moment like a man clawing his way back from years of exhaustion. But the deeper problem never went away. Jackson still couldn't manage more than about 5 hours of sleep a night, and as rehearsals for This Is It intensified through April, demanding hours of dancing and vocal work from a 50-year-old body that had already been pushed through decades of the same relentless grind, Lee said he needed something stronger than vitamins and juice. That's when he first said the word that would define the rest of his life, propofol. He told her about a drug called deepening, the brand name for propofol, a powerful anesthetic normally reserved for hospital operating rooms, used to knock surgical patients unconscious before a procedure. Jackson said he'd been given it once before during a past surgery, and that it was the only thing that had ever truly knocked him out, the only thing that gave him real, dreamless rest instead of the shallow, broken sleep that left him more tired than when he'd started. Lee had never even heard of anyone using propofol outside a hospital, so she went and did her own research, and what she learned frightened her enough that she went back to Jackson and told him plainly it was far too dangerous to use in a home setting, that this was not a medication anyone should be self-administering or having administered casually by a private doctor with no hospital equipment around him. Jackson pushed back. He told her that doctors had reassured him it was perfectly safe as long as someone stayed to monitor him while he slept, watching his vital signs the entire time, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. He said the words that would later feel almost unbearable in hindsight. "I know this will knock me out." And Lee, sitting there across from the most famous entertainer on the planet, asked him the only question that mattered. "What if you don't wake up?" Jackson didn't flinch. He simply repeated that he would be safe as long as he was monitored, as though repeating it enough times could make it true. That same overnight session on April 19th became the moment Lee refused him for the final time, telling him directly that any doctor willing to give him propofol at home wasn't acting out of care for him at all, but simply chasing the money that came with keeping the world's biggest pop star happy. She told him something else that stuck with her long after his death, that she had been around him long enough by then to love him like family, and that was exactly why she would never be the one to hand him something that could kill him. Jackson asked her to stay in the room and physically watch him try to fall asleep that night, and it was during that overnight vigil, sometime around 4:30 in the morning, that he suddenly bolted upright and stood on the bed, startling her with the intensity in his eyes as he told her again that he simply could not sleep. That was the last time Sherilyn Lee ever saw Michael Jackson in person. Just over 2 weeks later, on May 6th, an executive at AEG Live, the concert promoter bankrolling the entire This Is It comeback, wrote in an internal email that hiring a cardiologist named Dr. Conrad Murray as Jackson's full-time personal physician was officially a done deal at a staggering salary of $150,000 a month. Murray had first crossed paths with Jackson back in 2006 in Las Vegas, treating one of the singer's children, and now he was being brought on board specifically to travel with Jackson to London and keep him healthy enough to perform 50 consecutive nights on the biggest stage of his career. What almost nobody around Jackson seemed to fully register was that the man they were hiring to protect him would, within 6 weeks, be giving him propofol nearly every single night just to get him to sleep. Lee wasn't the only medical professional who said no to Jackson's request. A doctor named Alan Metzger, who examined Jackson just 1 day before Lee's final refusal, testified that Jackson had begged him for the same anesthetic, and Metzger turned him down too, offering sleeping pills instead that had worked for the singer in the past. Two trained professionals, independently dealt in the same 48-hour window, looked at Michael Jackson and told him this drug was too dangerous to bring into his own bedroom. Only Conrad Murray said yes. By June, with the London shows just weeks away, Jackson's insomnia had become something closer to a crisis than a symptom, and Murray had settled into an almost unbelievable nightly ritual, arriving at the house, monitoring Jackson with a pulse oximeter clipped to his finger, and infusing him with propofol mixed with lidocaine to dull the sting of the injection night after night after night for roughly 6 weeks straight. Murray would later admit to police that he recognized Jackson might be developing a dependency on the drug and claimed he'd started trying to wean him off it in the days right before his death, replacing some of the propofol doses with other sedatives instead. On June 21st, just 4 days before Jackson died, Sherilyn Lee, who no longer worked for him but still cared deeply about what happened to him, got a frantic phone call from someone on Jackson's staff. In the background, she could hear Jackson himself, and what he was saying chilled her. "Find me an anesthesiologist. I don't care how much money they want. Find me an anesthesiologist to be with me here overnight and give me this IV." He was in visible distress, complaining that one side of his body felt hot while the other felt cold. A strange, alarming symptom that immediately set off alarm bells for Lee, who suspected right away that whatever was happening to him was connected to whatever drug he'd already been given. She told the staffer plainly to get him to a hospital immediately. He never went. Looking back on that call years later, Lee said she instantly recognized that something had hit his central nervous system, that whatever he'd been given was affecting him at a level far beyond simple insomnia, and that despite everything he wanted, which was simply to sleep, he was, in her words, in real trouble. 3 days after that call, on June 24th, Jackson arrived at the Staples Center in Los Angeles around 6:30 in the evening for rehearsal, joking with a magician named Ed Alonzo about having laryngitis before finally taking the stage around 9 o'clock that night. Alonzo would later say Jackson looked great, full of energy, dancing and performing with a spark that gave no outward sign of the storm building underneath. The rehearsal ran past midnight. Jackson finally made it back to his rented mansion on Carrollwood Drive around 1 in the morning, and roughly 30 minutes later he climbed into bed. What happened over the next 10 hours would become the most scrutinized medical timeline in modern entertainment history, reconstructed piece by piece in a Los Angeles courtroom 2 years later. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Jackson called Murray directly, complaining of dehydration and, once again, his relentless insomnia. Murray responded by giving him a 10-milligram tablet of diazepam at 1:30, hoping the sedative would ease him into sleep. It didn't work. At 3 o'clock, Murray injected 2 milligrams of lorazepam. Jackson remained awake. 2 hours later, at 5 in the morning, Murray gave him a second dose of lorazepam, still awake. At 7:30 that morning, with the sun already up, Murray administered 2 milligrams of midazolam. And still, according to Murray's own later account, Jackson lay there completely conscious, exhausted beyond words, but chemically unable to surrender to sleep, repeatedly asking, then demanding, the one thing he believed would finally end the torment: propofol. Finally, at 10:50 in the morning, after nearly 10 straight hours of failed sedation, Murray gave in and administered the drug Jackson had been begging for through the entire night. According to prosecutors, this was the moment everything changed. At some point after that final dose, Murray stepped away from Jackson's bedside. Precisely how long remains one of the most fiercely disputed details of the entire case, with one witness later testifying she was on the phone with Murray for 3 or 4 minutes when she heard him suddenly go quiet, followed by what sounded like coughing and mumbling in the background. When Murray returned to the room, Michael Jackson was not breathing. What Murray did next would become the foundation of an entire criminal trial. He began CPR, but instead of performing it correctly on a hard, flat surface with both hands, as any trained medical professional would know to do, he compressed Jackson's chest with only one hand while the singer remained on the soft, unsinking mattress of his own bed, a technique so fundamentally flawed that a defense expert witness would later testify under oath that he himself would have done things completely differently, that he would have immediately called for help, called 911, and begun proper resuscitation on the floor. But Murray didn't call 911. Instead, according to evidence later uncovered by investigators, he made a series of private phone calls on his cell phone during the very window when Jackson lay dying, calls he never disclosed to law enforcement when they first interviewed him. Nearly an hour passed. It was only when Murray finally ran downstairs and pleaded for help from Jackson's household staff that the emergency truly began to unfold in front of other witnesses. Alberto Alvarez, Jackson's director of logistics, was the first member of the security team to rush into that bedroom, and what he walked into would stay with him for the rest of his life. Murray, according to Alvarez's testimony, was performing chest compressions with just his left hand while Jackson lay motionless on the bed. Before anything else happened, Murray turned to Alvarez with an urgent instruction that had nothing to do with saving Jackson's life. "Help me gather these vials." Alvarez, believing Murray had Jackson's best interest at heart, began collecting medicine bottles scattered around the bedside and placing them into a blue bag, exactly as instructed. Murray then pointed him toward an IV stand holding a bag of saline solution with a small amount of a milky white substance visible inside it, a bottle of propofol, tucked into that bag, and told Alvarez to remove it and place it into the same bag as everything else. Only afterward did Murray tell him to call 911. Alvarez also testified that Murray specifically instructed him not to let Jackson's children see their father in that condition. So, as chaos swirled around the bed, Alvarez ushered Prince, Paris, and Blanket out of the room, sparing them, at least in that moment, from witnessing what was happening to their father. The 911 call finally went out at 12:21 in the afternoon, nearly an hour and a half after Murray had first discovered Jackson unresponsive. Alvarez told the dispatcher plainly that Jackson was unconscious and not breathing, and when the dispatcher began walking him through CPR instructions over the phone, Alvarez explained that Jackson's own personal doctor was already there, already attempting it. The dispatcher's response, captured in that recording, said something almost eerie in hindsight, that if a doctor was already on scene performing CPR, that doctor outranked any instruction the dispatcher himself could offer. A strange kind of medical authority granted in that moment to a man who had already spent the previous hour making the situation immeasurably worse. Paramedics arrived at 12:26, just 5 minutes after the call went out, and found Michael Jackson in full cardiac arrest, without a pulse, without breath, his heart showing no electrical activity at all. They inserted a breathing tube, began chest compressions, administered epinephrine to try to shock some rhythm back into his heart, and none of it restored his circulation. For 42 full minutes, paramedics worked on him inside the bedroom before finally loading him into an ambulance for the drive to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. An emergency room doctor there would later testify that by the time Jackson arrived, he was, in the doctor's own clinical assessment, already clinically dead. Doctors at the hospital continued resuscitation efforts anyway, refusing to give up on the 50-year-old entertainer for more than an hour, but there was simply nothing left to bring back. At 2:26 in the afternoon on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was formally pronounced dead. Word spread through the hospital hallways before it ever reached the press, and Jackson's family began arriving in waves. His children, his mother Catherine, his sisters Latoya and siblings, his longtime manager Frank DeLeo, walking into a hospital they had raced to reach only to learn they'd arrived too late to say goodbye while he was still breathing. Within hours, the news detonated across the entire planet. Fans gathered outside the hospital, outside Neverland Ranch, outside his childhood home in Gary, Indiana, where the city's own mayor came out to stand with the crowd as the flag above City Hall was lowered to half-staff in his honor. World leaders issued statements. Nelson Mandela said the loss would be felt everywhere. But underneath the global grief, investigators had already begun quietly building a very different story, one that would take more than 2 years to fully surface in a Los Angeles courtroom. On August 28, 2009, the Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner released its official finding. Michael Jackson's death was a homicide, caused by acute propofol intoxication, compounded by the anti-anxiety benzodiazepines lorazepam and midazolam also found in his system. The very same drugs Murray had been cycling through that final desperate night, trying and failing to sedate a man whose body had built up an almost unbelievable tolerance to sedation itself. Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and his trial, which began in September 2011, became a televised spectacle that pulled the entire world into the most intimate, painful details of Jackson's final hours. Prosecutors, led by Deputy District Attorney David Walgren, argued that Murray had abandoned every basic principle of responsible medical care, using what amounted to a makeshift IV setup to administer a hospital-grade anesthetic inside a private bedroom, with none of the monitoring equipment or resuscitation tools that any real operating room would require. Murray's defense argued the opposite, that Jackson, desperate and impatient, had woken up during a brief moment when Murray stepped out of the room and self-administered an additional, a fatal dose of propofol on his own, becoming, in their telling, the architect of his own death. The jury didn't believe it. On November 7, 2011, Conrad Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years in county jail, though he would ultimately serve less than 2 years before his release. Chairlyn Lee's testimony during the related civil trial, years later, added something the criminal case alone never fully captured: the human desperation underneath all of it. She described a man who wasn't chasing a high or an escape, but simply, achingly chasing sleep, something most people take entirely for granted, something Jackson hadn't been able to hold on to in any real, sustained way for months. She recalled how he'd told her once that he needed something that would make him fall asleep immediately, how he'd sat close to her and said the words almost like a plea rather than a demand. And she remembered, through tears on the witness stand, the exact moment she'd asked him the question that would end up defining everything that followed. What if you didn't wake up? A question Michael Jackson heard, absorbed, and ultimately chose not to let stop him, because somewhere along the way he had convinced himself, or been convinced by people less careful than Sherilyn Lee, that as long as someone was watching, he would always be safe. He wasn't. And what makes her account so devastating, more than a decade after she first spoke publicly about those final months, isn't just what she witnessed. It's what she couldn't stop. She saw the warning signs months in advance. She refused the drug that would eventually kill him. She warned the people around him that whoever agreed to give it to him wasn't acting in his interest. And still, somewhere between her final refusal on April 19th and Conrad Murray's fatal injection at 10:50 in the morning on June 25th, the King of Pop found someone willing to say yes to the one thing every person who genuinely cared about him had already told him could cost him his life. And by the time paramedics reached that bedroom on Carrollwood Drive, there was nothing left for anyone, doctor or nurse or family member, to do but confirm what Sherilyn Lee had feared from the very first moment he asked her for that IV.